All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're going to shatter some major myths and look at how a notorious insurgent group, Al-Qaeda, actually operated with the sophistication of a multinational corporation. Usually when we think of global security threats, we picture chaotic, shadowy networks, right? Just relying on brute force and total anarchy. But what happens if we look at them through a completely different lens? What if we analyze an insurgent group as if it were a Fortune 500 company, just operating without traditional legal frameworks? Because it turns out that is exactly how they were built.
So here's the business case study we're unpacking today. First, we'll dismantle the cave dweller myth. Then we'll explore the terrorist C-suite, audit how they finance the operation, review their media and PR department, and finally, trace their forced evolution into a global franchise model.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, the cave dweller myth. When you hear about these guys, you probably picture isolated fighters hiding out in some remote mountains, living entirely off the grid. But the reality? Well, the documents and hard drives recovered by counterterrorism authorities paint a completely different picture. We are talking about a highly structured, bureaucratic organization. They were using meticulous network folders, massive spreadsheets, and dedicated strategic planners. They were logging day-to-day operations, tracking mundane receipts, and even getting into petty, bureaucratic office drama, just like you'd find in a standard corporate office. And honestly, this corporate structuring is exactly why authorities eventually realized that the best way to track them wasn't always on the battlefield. It was by following the money and the paperwork. Just look at how they communicated. According to recovered laptop files detailed by journalist Alan Cullison, they deliberately adopted a corporate vocabulary to mask their communications from intelligence agencies. Osama bin Laden, he was simply referred to as the contractor. Acts of terror were casually discussed in memos as trade. Mullah Omar and the Taliban literally became the Omar Brothers Company, and Western intelligence agencies were just called foreign competitors. It was a very calculated strategy to mimic a multinational corporation.
Which brings us to Section 2, the terrorist C-suite.
What's absolutely fascinating here is that their setup looks exactly like an organizational chart for a major corporate conglomerate. Notice that at the top, you don't just have a lone dictator calling all the shots. Instead, you have the Emir Shura Council. This council essentially acted as the board of directors, complete with formal meetings. They were the ones responsible for directing the overall long-term strategy of the organization, making sure that every regional operation perfectly aligned with their overarching business objectives. And right beneath that board of directors, they had highly specialized corporate departments to manage day-to-day business. I'm talking about a military committee handling operations and training, basically their core product division, a finance committee responsible for fundraising and hiding assets, an information committee essentially acting as an in-house PR firm. They even had a foreign purchases committee acting as a dedicated supply chain management team. Just think about the sheer absurdity of an insurgent group needing a dedicated foreign purchases committee. It really highlights that this wasn't a ragtag group. It was a massive bureaucracy designed to systematically execute huge, long-term projects.
Moving on to Section 3, financing the operation.
$30 million. That massive number was their estimated annual operating budget prior to the year 2001. Now, there's a pretty huge lingering myth out there that this entire operation was funded by one guy's vast personal inheritance. But financial investigations proved that completely wrong. In reality, this multi-million-dollar budget was raised almost entirely hand-to-mouth, year after year. They built a dedicated network of financial facilitators, relying heavily on donations from both witting and completely unwitting sources. They were siphoning funds, particularly during religious holidays and charity drives, just to meet their massive overhead. And because they had to rely on relentless fundraising to hit that $30 million quota, they were incredibly strict with their ledgers. Enter Sheikh Qari Sa'id, their chief professional accountant. In a truly bizarre twist of extreme bureaucracy, this tight-fisted accountant famously vetoed a $1,500 travel expense request for the operatives who were actively planning the 9/11 attacks. Why? Because it simply wasn't in the budget. It literally required an executive override from the CEO, bin Laden himself, to approve the travel fund so the operatives could actually move forward. So you might be wondering, how do you move $30 million around the globe to fund these operations without any standard business oversight? Well, they relied heavily on the hawala system. Basically, this is an informal, undocumented ledger system based purely on trust between a network of international brokers. Because it operates completely outside of traditional banking and legal frameworks, it leaves virtually no paper trail. And as you can imagine, this lack of a paper trail was a massive headache for authorities trying to track and freeze their assets.
What this created was a totally unconventional web designed specifically to bypass international financial regulations. Money would flow from those witting and unwitting donors straight to financial facilitators. Then, those facilitators would use trusted hawaladars and human couriers to physically transport the assets. This whole process culminated in high-stakes, undocumented cash handoffs. For example, in one major operation, a plot leader literally handed a courier over $120,000 in physical cash in Dubai to fund operatives abroad. No wire transfers, no bank holds, just physical assets moving through a global network of trust.
All right, let's look at Section 4, the media and PR department. 90% of the battle is fought in the media. That's a direct quote from their leadership. And it proves they viewed public relations and marketing not just as a little side project, but as their primary operational battleground. They understood a fundamental corporate truth. If they wanted to build a global brand and attract a steady stream of new recruits, they had to control the narrative just as effectively as they planned their physical operations. And to win that media battle, they built an incredibly sophisticated tech stack. Counterterrorism officials were absolutely shocked by what they found. While operatives were supposedly roughing it in remote, isolated caves, they were actually editing documentary-quality propaganda on ultralight Sony Vaio laptops. They used top-end video cameras, protected their digital files with unbreakable PGP encryption software, and ran a highly prolific in-house production studio called a Sahab. They were churning out polished content on flash memory drives every few days. They even had a deep understanding of target demographics and localization. Get this, they actually utilized an American convert named Adam Gadon as a media star, an in-house consultant. Why? Because they recognized they needed localized expertise to properly address and penetrate the US market. It's literally the exact same logic a global corporation uses when they hire a regional marketing director to adapt their brand and messaging for a foreign audience. Finally, that brings us to Section 5, the franchise model. Following 2001, intense global military and regulatory pressure systematically destroyed their safe havens. The organization realized they could no longer operate as a rigid, centralized hierarchy with tight lines of command and centralized resources. So to survive, they had to pull off a dramatic pivot. They transformed into a decentralized franchise and brand. They completely shifted from commanding and funding massive centralized operations to merely inspiring autonomous nodes scattered all across the globe. So today, their new corporate reality is that the organization functions a lot more like a venture capital firm or even a global licensing brand. They have regional franchises in places like Yemen and Somalia. Instead of micromanaging local attacks, the core leadership just provides a compelling narrative. They publish digital manuals, like the Technical Mujahid, online, and they rely entirely on self-radicalized actors who ideologically self-identify with the brand to carry out the work locally. They essentially created a franchise licensing model for insurgency. And this leaves us with a really critical, ongoing dilemma for global security. We've seen how they built a multinational corporate blueprint, complete with HR, finance committees, and high-tech PR departments. But now that they've evolved from a physical hierarchy into a decentralized franchise held together by an ideology, well, that fundamentally challenges everything we know about conflict. If an insurgent group is no longer just a physical organization, but a global brand, how does the world actually fight an idea? Definitely something to chew on as we wrap up today's explainer.